Share my screen. A little rusty. I haven't done this in a couple months, so cool. All right, so welcome everybody. Yeah, really excited to start class. This, like I mentioned it before, this is a little bit shorter class than I usually do. I usually do like 6 or 7 weeks, and we're only doing 4 weeks this week. So it'll be interesting. We'll see how intense this gets. I do have a class schedule that I've sort of have set up for us. It's always TBD depending on how things go and that sort of thing. Like I think already I'm gonna skip a session and do it next week just based on time that I think we have, but that's great. So we'll go through a couple different tools. That's sort of the goal for this class. I want to show a couple different ways to approach making animations using a variety of different tools. And also kind of tie that to sort of like what I know about like animation history and animation techniques. So we'll kind of tie that to that as well. Do a little bit of discussion, look at some work that I think is interesting, both like current work as well as historical work, and then also talk about how to use some of these tools. So again, like we'll go through Midjourney, Deform Studio. We'll look at using a company called Eden, which is they have an API we'll use. And then last week we'll use Comfy UI, which I expect some people have used, but maybe not everybody. But it's again a very, very powerful tool. So we'll kind of go from like easiest to hardest, I think, week by week, and we'll kind of add skills as we go on. So like what we do today in Midjourney will definitely still be applicable all the way toward the end of the sessions. But Midjourney is kind of the easiest in the sense of like it's both easy and a lot of manual work, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So yeah, we will take breaks during class, like 5 to 10 minute breaks, usually at around the hour mark, just so everyone can stand up, get some water, that sort of thing. So there's live materials. There's also going to be recordings. I've already shared one of the recordings, which is sort of like my basic discussion of how diffusion models work. If you haven't watched that yet, not a big deal. Maybe watch it between now and next week. I will do a recap of that and as well as add some layers to it for the work we're going to do. But there'll be also other recordings as well. Other thing is that there will be the syllabus. The syllabus will link to all of the class recordings, as well as any materials that we have for the following weeks. So this week, there's a lot of reference materials, a lot of films to watch if you want to. I'll link to slides, recordings, list out whatever homework we have, that sort of thing. So please feel free to use that as you want. This will be accessible basically forever. It was just going to be hosted on my Drive account. I don't really plan to ever remove it. So you can always bookmark that link as sort of your like go-to, because as I mentioned, the Slack channel is only going to last for 90 days and everything starts to disappear. So use that as sort of your bookmark for everything we cover in class in the future. There's additional Q&A time. We've already talked about that. It's going to be Thursdays most weeks going forward. Again, you can also DM me and ask about additional time if you need to, like that sort of thing. I'm always flexible to work on that. And then the Slack channel is really more for discussions. That'll be both this group as well as the async group to have like Q&A time. You can ask questions there. You can share work. You can share other things. In the past, people have shared like, hey, I saw this video on Instagram. How do people make it? We can talk about that. Like maybe that gets built into some of the material we cover, that sort of thing. And that's really meant for just like anyone to just share stuff. So like, please feel free to use that as you see fit. I will ask that people try to thread stuff if they can, just because it can get kind of chaotic with 50 people responding in different moments, that sort of thing. So try to use threads if you can. Main objectives for this class is like, I want to talk about animation techniques. I know a lot of people are discussing like, there are generative video models today, but I'm actually kind of like not going to cover as much of that for this course. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. But mostly I'm interested in sort of this animation technique. I've kind of calling it stop motion, but not really. We'll cover that in a minute as well. But like, that's sort of the goal. And I want to look at different techniques. I want to sort of reference what has already happened in the history of animation and sort of apply that using AI tools. And that's kind of the goal of this class, is to kind of merge those two. It is very niche, but one of the nice things about when I teach these classes this way is I can teach whatever the hell I want. So we're going to teach some niche shit and like have fun with it and kind of explore those things. We're gonna do a lot of stuff with different tools. I've got 4 tools, so a new tool every week, which is kind of crazy to be honest, but like I think it's gonna give everyone a little bit of exposure to these things, and you can kind of decide what works best for you. And then, as I mentioned, different animation techniques and their history. I'm gonna assume that everyone has at least used an image generation tool at least once. It didn't sound like anyone that wasn't the case. Whether it's Midjourney, DALL-E, I don't know, all the other diffusion tools, whatever it is. And that you're at least familiar with the concept of prompt engineering. this isn't going to be a prompt engineering class. I'm not going to like spend a week talking about prompt engineering. I also don't think prompt engineering necessarily matters as much for this material. Um, if you're looking for prompt engineering resources, I'm happy to provide some. But the goal of this is just to like generate images and have fun and like not necessarily like get into the nitty gritty of prompt engineering. I will cover some interesting tools or like things will help with that, but we'll get to that when we get to that. If that isn't you, just please DM me. I'm happy to like send you more materials. And then lastly, there's no coding knowledge expected of you. Anything that relies on code, like I will provide it with you for you. In some cases, that code might not do everything you want to be do, in which case we can talk about me either making edits to it or figuring out some other way around it. I think like one of the interesting things about this class in particular is like some of the stuff is going to be challenging, meaning it's going to be a new interface. A lot of these interfaces are very crude. They're not the best, I admit. There's also gonna be a lot of like manual labor, like downloading 40 images and kind of like hand stitching them together. Like, so any familiarity with that or any ability to do that work was going to get you further along in this class. Like, this isn't like one of those classes where like we go through generative video and you learn how to prompt engineer and then it just spits out great video for you. Like, this is definitely a class where there's like some work involved in kind of like massaging these things to do what you want. And I'm gonna try to help as much as I can with tools that will make that easier. But there is at the end of the day just gonna be like, I have an idea to do this, and it's like, well, that doesn't exist yet. So like, let's figure out how to make it together, or like, let's figure out how to do a manual way before we automate it. I mentioned this in my email to everyone, but there is some cost associated with these tools. I personally don't expect you to pay for each one of these tools. I do pay for all of them, which is insane and very annoying. Most of these are on like monthly subscriptions, and every month at the beginning of the month, I just get hit with like 30 bills, which is very annoying. Um, so just be aware, like each of these does have a cost. It varies a little bit depending on the tool. And I would say, like, honestly, maybe this week you just watch me use a tool and you're like, I'm not really that interested in this tool. I'm not going to pay for it. Totally reasonable. In some cases, I might have credits where I'll say like, hey, for this week, you can use my credits. But then if you like making your first video with this, like please sign up and subscribe for it yourself. A lot of these tools are made by independent people. Like I happen to know a lot of people that make these tools. So I think like it's not like we're giving money to OpenAI. Like, this is like mostly like smaller startups or that sort of thing. So I think it's like it's worth it. I know you're giving this money to the right people and not like, these crazy corporations. So yeah, just watch a tutorial and kind of decide if it's worth it for you. And if not, like that's fine. A lot of these are also monthly subscriptions where you can pay for a month as long as you set a reminder for yourself, which of course I never do. So be better than me essentially. If you set a reminder to cancel after the end of this class, it may be in the last week of I'll like remind everyone to cancel all their subscriptions. Totally reasonable, and I think most of them will work fine with that. These are the tools we're going to look at for this class, and here's the associated price with them. Midjourney is $10 a month. Deform is you can pay a flat fee of $8 to generate 20 videos. Eden is another $10 a month, and Comfy UI, depending on what computer you have, it could be free for you. But I'm going to recommend a tool called Run Comfy, which is sort of a cloud provider, and that's like 80 cents an hour. And you'll kind of get a sense of what that really means when we go through these lessons. But try to keep the cost pretty low here. If there are any issues with like price, like please let me know. And for most of these, I do have credits and I have logins. Like I can try to figure out something for this class, at least for you. So again, why do I teach this class? I think it's because whenever I show up in a different creative space, whether it's a filmmaking space or an AI space, people ask me what I do. And often I have to be like, I guess I'm an animator. I guess that's what I do. And then that like leads to like these like hour-long conversations about what it means to be an animator. And I never really have any good answers there. It's like, oh, do you do hand animation? Like, do you like animate on the twos or the threes? And it's like, it's not really how I approach animation. It's sort of like more of a conceptual process. But I like thinking about things as animations. And I think as we play with these tools, we'll also be able to see like, I think they also lend themselves to some sort of animation sort of process. So I also like am very interested in the history of filmmaking and the history of animation. And like a lot of what I try to do is pull like historical techniques or ideas from that and apply them in like a new, more experimental way. So I'm very interested in experimental filmmaking and like how we can take sort of modern tools and apply that to some of the historical like ways of making film and that sort of thing. And this I've already gotten some hate DMs around calling this a stop motion class. Like I think, animation is an insanely time intensive process, and I have like a huge respect for people who do hand animation, whether it's by drawing or stop motion or whatever it is. And I don't really necessarily want to degrade that work by saying like, oh, I do that too as an AI artist. But it's more of an analogy for me. Like I think there's ways for us to work together on these things. And I think one of the interesting things I'm looking forward to as we get further on in the class is like how we can leverage like literal stop motion tools and then add to that using AI and those sort of things. So I think I see it as an additive thing, not an A or B binary kind of process. I think there's just a lot of opportunities with AI tools. And I think, as people mentioned, like I see a lot of shitty AI work. And I think there's like equally like good AI work or ways to use these tools that are more interesting than just trying to replace what already exists in the world. And I think that's what I'm sort of excited about. It sounds like that's what other people are excited about as well. So I'm definitely looking forward. And that will always be my sort of lens on this, which is like, we're not going to go remake Studio Ghibli films. Like we're going to like figure out our own process, our own thing for this, I've actually been using these processes and these techniques probably since 2019, 2020. This was a very initial animation I made. I was able to make this on Runway. They have like a batch process that they've now long deleted. And this would take in old experimental films and run it through a process called Big Bygan, which again is a model like basically no longer exists. It's impossible to use unless you've got really old hardware. But this sort of like batch processing system was a way for me to take animations and basically run them through AI tools. So even back then, I was sort of realizing like, oh, there's a way to do this, which isn't reliant on video generation tools, but is using some other experiences. This uses Stan Brackage's The Dante Quartet, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. I think is really fascinating. I do a lot of sort of work where I take video as an input, and we'll talk about this a lot more throughout the next couple weeks, and then process these as sort of stop motion. And this is a film where it actually sort of like also uses other techniques to sort of interject different prompts. There's actually like a couple different pieces of video, and then using After Effects, it like randomly grabs frames from each one of them and then inserts them. I might cover that probably as like bonus material for anyone that's interested. But that's a little bit of sort of a lot of the work I do these days as well, which is like kind of taking the stop motion effect and then doing more with it as well. I'm also very interested in sort of the line between analog as well as digital AI. So this is a project I finished this summer. It's called Dot, and it's basically a bunch of hand animated, hand bleached, and hand painted frames on 16 mm film that were then scanned in, and then every frame was sort of extracted digitally and then fed through a machine learning model, and the machine learning model figured out what the closest frame was to the other frames. So this is actually completely animated by AI. But the images themselves are analog. They've been processed and scanned. I'm very interested in this as like a process again of like leveraging AI in a way that's not purely generative, but is actually generative when you think about it in terms of time or in terms of animation. Again, I'll probably cover this technique as like a bonus material because it is very computationally expensive and it takes a lot longer than 2 hours. But I might make a little recording on just how this process works because I'm very interested to see other people try to use it as well. And then I would say if there's anything you want to watch from my material or my work, it would probably be this piece, which is floral zombification via attention node networks. It's a second iteration I made this last spring. And this kind of covers a bunch of techniques we're going to cover in class. Different stop motion techniques, different video techniques. And this is all done using Eden, which is one of the tools we use. So just a little heads up on like what this process is this was all made from an old 16 mm educational film using time-lapse flowers. Each of these frames sort of split out and then animated using Eden's tools. So there's this sort of a stop motion effect you'll see here. There is also feeding in video source and again, breaking those into frames and then using AI tools to actually sort of like draw on top of these shapes. And then lastly, there's like a purely video to video technique, which I think we'll actually look at next week when we look at deform. There's a way to sort of do this, these sort of techniques together where we're taking in an input video and actually animating on top of it. This isn't stop motion in a way, but it's kind of similar in the way the techniques work. So this film kind of covers like probably the most of like techniques in some ways. So if you are interested, take a look at that and any like question about how I made a certain section, I'm happy to answer that as well. as I said, I'm very interested in also the history of animation. There's also a lot of other artists who have done what I would describe as similar aesthetics of work while not being using AI, right? So actually just last week or 2 weeks ago, I watched this video from an animator by the name of Jeff Scher. It's called Garden Regrets, and it's like this beautiful, like very, staccato sort of animation style. But again, it uses that sort of similar idea of like some consistency in motion, but then has this very like flickering sort of style. I should also mention like a lot of my films like flicker quite a lot. I don't know if Jeff is still teaching SVA. I saw that he's like rescanning all of his work. I think he may have retired now, and he's like basically making an archive of all of his work now. But there's a couple of films from him that are really great, and they're all up on Vimeo as well. All these films are linked to from the syllabus as well if you want to watch those. I would definitely recommend spending a little bit of time just watching them and seeing what you have. I realized that a lot of this was very much male artists. I wanted to make sure we included a really great female animator, Jody Mack. I don't know if anyone knows Jody's work. Her work is amazing. What I like about Jody's work is she never describes animation as sort of this like, she describes animation as bringing life to things, which I think is a great way to describe what animation is. A lot of her work is, non-sequential images, but the way they flicker and the way they move, like creates motion in a different way that I think is really fascinating and definitely something worth exploring in this class. Like it's not necessarily something we're going to cover like purely, although maybe today is kind of this way. It could be depending on what you use your prompts. But I love this idea of like you do get some motion in this piece, like right the swirling kind of effect, but like none of this stuff feels like it's like a body in motion or that sort of thing. I mentioned this piece, which is Stan Brakhge's The Dante Quartet. I don't, you kind of have to talk about Stan's work in like animation, I think. What I actually like about his work is, especially in this piece, is things are not like moving at a set frame rate. They kind of change frame rates, they slow down, they speed up, which again is not a thing that's super easy with these tools today, but could be something fun to explore. So a lot of this is just like putting different ideas in front of everyone and seeing what you kind of resonate with. These were all hand painted, I think 70mm slides, and then used an optical printer to sort of print them at what we call step printing, which we'll talk about maybe next week or actually the week after, to sort of create these different sequences or different effects of speed. And then lastly, like one other thing we'll talk about, like which is happening in my own work as well as in other things. This is a film from Paul Bush called Episodes from the Life of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What I love about this is made completely with humans. Like it's not like a stop motion piece on an animation stand. It's like shot in the real world with real actors. And I kind of love the idea of like creating animations, but doing it with like people. So I think it's really fascinating, again, this like way in which things move from like the 2D animation world to like a 3D world in film and back again. And like, I think we're even seeing stuff like this happening on TikTok today, which I'll talk about toward the end of class. But yeah, there's just like some really fascinating stuff here. So again, all these videos are linked to in the syllabus. Feel free to watch them. Lots of cool ideas, lots of things to think about and consider as you work through this. So as people have mentioned, like right now, all the hype is around generative AI. Why is this not a generative AI video class? Mostly because I just don't think AI video is that cool just yet. Like I'm just not really that excited about it. And there's some interesting things that are happening with it, but I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is, we've all talked, I think everyone has sort of touched a little bit on control and like, how do we make some of our work, like if we have an idea for a thing, how do we impact our idea on that work? And in my personal opinion, like I've done a ton of stuff around AI video. I just find it's a crapshoot. It's like a dice roll of whether or not you get a good video back. Even with great prompting, even with like all these sort of like prompt assistance tools, I find that like, especially with the work that I want to generate, I get about 25% of the time I get a good video result. And like, quite honestly, that's a hard thing to teach. Like, it's just like, well, you're going to try some shit and it might get a good result back. You might not. I just don't think that's like, it doesn't feel like a thing that's like teachable or like there's anything fun other than just like the random chance of this sort of video generation stuff. So as of today, I think that's kind of where the AI video stuff is, which is fun. It's fun to make random stuff and then like piece it together. The problem I see is like, this stuff is expensive. Like I think all these platforms start at $30 a month and they go much, much higher very quickly from there. If you're spending $30 a month and you get maybe like 50 credits to generate video and 25% of those don't work, Like you're now at like you get 12 good 10-second clips out of this per month. And it's just like that's not a reasonable way to work. And I like have a lot of beef with all the companies that are like making these high subscription costs. So I just don't think it's a fun thing to teach yet. Like I think like with the stuff that we're gonna look at, like the pricing is a little bit more reasonable. You can get it with like very cheap if you go purely comfy UI and you've got to generate it on your side and you are okay with some slow results. Like you can get some pretty affordable stuff there. I just don't think AI video is there yet. I assume in like 6 months or maybe even next month, like someone's gonna make me look like an asshole or a liar, and I'll teach that class then. Also, I kind of mentioned this, which is like I think a lot of generative AI right now is positioned to be like we're gonna replace Hollywood or gonna replace the camera. And I'm just kind of not that excited about that idea. Like it's like I have a lot of friends who are very good DPs or very good filmmakers, and like I appreciate their work. And I think like I would love AI video to be something different, and I think it can be. I think there are some good results out there, but in general, I'm just kind of like underwhelmed by most of these models. They try to reproduce like very Hollywood aesthetic kind of things. So as of now, I'm not really interested in teaching that class, but in the future, maybe that changes. So again, maybe next month, maybe in 6 months, I will actually be teaching that class. I also kind of like being a little behind on trends. I think it's like just more interesting. There's more pockets for exploration if you're a little behind on stuff. So again, we'll kind of cover different tools outside of AI video. If anyone's interested in AI video, I do have done a lot of exploration in that area, and I can direct you to things. But in general, it's like not the most exciting just yet. So as I mentioned, this is called stop motion, but that's kind of like an analogy rather than like an actual thing that we're going to be doing. Although for anyone that does do stop motion, I think we can look at like some ways to actually do something interesting with that. I got a couple people DMing me that were like, "You shouldn't call it stop motion. That's like it's like a an affront to stop motion," and they're probably right. But it's like I think there's something about the effect or the vibe of how these films feel that does feel kind of stop motiony, which I like, and that's why I decided to call it that. Um, Also, we'll probably get this more next week, but like most AI image generation tools today use what's called a diffusion model. Diffusion models, I sort of like describe this as like more animism of like diffusion models want to make images in this way. Um, the way generative video works is like it's a diffusion model on top of a diffusion model. And I think those actually like kind of like distorts how a diffusion model wants to work. This might be very abstract until we talk about what diffusion models are next week. But essentially, like the idea is like I kind of see this as like the way that a diffusion model wants to work, and that it wants to generate single images, and it wants them to be sort of like discretely different from each other. And I think by using that technology and like exploring what diffusion models are, how they work, like we can play with the amount of difference frame to frame and actually use that as a control factor, a way to change the aesthetic of certain things. And that's kind of what I'm really interested in here. And I think that's what we'll kind of explore over the next couple weeks. Like this week, we'll start with very, very basic, like you might not even know how diffusion models work. Just generate a bunch of images that are kind of related to each other, and we'll stitch them together. Over the next couple weeks, we'll add layers to that to be able to control the amount of difference frame to frame. We'll add in other input controls, like sort of other conditioning models, that sort of thing, to maintain more consistency or less consistency, which can be a way of working. Let's see, where are we at with time? 8:45. Okay, we actually might do a diffusion model discussion. I thought that was going to take me way longer to get through. Why don't we do this? Let's take a little like 10-minute break now, because I need to re-up my tea before I start to lose my voice. So let's come back at like 5 till, and then we'll talk about diffusion models, and then we'll start to play with this week's sort of like image generation experience. All right, cool. So see you in 10 minutes. All right, so I realize I am also a very fast talker. If anyone has not been in one of my classes before, I know that was a lot of information, and probably like kind of very abstract. So I'm interested, like, are there any questions, any thoughts as you like think about this material? None. Okay, cool. As always, please feel free to stop me with questions, either drop them in the chat or just like turn your mic on and yell at me. So, because I do speak very fast, and I was also like very nervous. I have like 90 slides for this, and it's like usually it's like a slide a minute. I was like, we're never gonna finish stuff, and then I of course ran through it. So we're doing well on time. Cool. I'm gonna go back to sharing, and then I think what we'll do is we'll just do a little brief introduction to diffusion models, how they work. This week it might not matter as much, but as we get into later weeks, I think we'll see that like understanding all the different parameters of a diffusion model is going to give us a little bit more of control. So like we'll probably come back to this material many times throughout the next couple weeks. Okay, so you probably have heard a lot about AI and a lot about machine learning and how we teach or train models to create images. And if there's anything I want you to get out of like this week is just like diffusion models do this one process in a particular way. And because of that, like we're going to be able to leverage that for various techniques as we go throughout class. So it turns out that the model or the technique or the network that most image generation models use today is called diffusion. That's if you've heard of the model Stable Diffusion, that is a type of diffusion model. OpenAI has their own version, like all these different companies, their own way of doing diffusion processes. And usually with machine learning, the best way to like think about how a machine learning model works is that it learns a process in one direction, and then by learning it in that direction, it can sort of invert that direction to do the opposite. That's how a lot of machine learning models work. So the diffusion process is essentially like what you do is you take an image and you add a bunch of noise to it. And what the model learns to do is it learns how an image should have noise added to it. So you've got this image of a cat, and you'll see like still kind of looks like a cat in this picture, looks less and less like a cat in this picture, and then it finally looks like complete noise. Now, this is not what the noise actually looks like for these models at the very end, but like that's okay. It's all more of like figurative analogy stuff, right? So what the machine learning model does, it learns how to add noise to images. And then once it does that, you can actually invert that process. So pretty much everything, every diffusion model or most image models today utilize the same concept. The actual technique and the way it does noising and that sort of thing changes network to network and changes over time. But essentially, you're taking a whole bunch of images, adding noise to it, and the model learns how you should add noise to an image while still maintaining the structure of those images. And once a model learns that, you can essentially invert that process. And this is what we call denoising. And this is basically you'll see denoise or a denoise value like pretty much in every model. If they make that parameter available to you. Something like Midjourney doesn't actually make that process available to you, but you can kind of figure out what's going on under the hood. So basically we take the process in reverse. So we generate a piece of noise and then we turn that into an image. Now the problem here is that like if I were to give you an image, like if I were to give you a noisy image like this, and I'd say like make a cat out of it, or like make any image out of this, like probabilistically you could make this into anything. And the very early diffusion models basically were trained on like a set of birds or a set of animals and would only be able to generate other birds or other animals because they didn't have this other thing, which is text prompting. So this could probabilistically make nearly anything. But how do we actually like tell the model what we want it to make and basically guide it in that direction? That's where text conditioning or text prompting comes into play. So you can think about a prompt as a way to condition the model to move in a certain direction by denoising the image. So the process, again, this is a little bit of an analogy and not necessarily how things work today, but ideally, like the way a process works today is there's a model called CLIP. You might have heard CLIP. It's now been kind of replaced by some other models, but essentially the CLIP model operates it helps guide the denoising process toward an image generation. So often these image generation models actually have a couple models inside of them. There's one that does the image generation. There's one that does the guidance conditioning it toward CLIP. There's now like 4 or 5 models in most of these models. There's multiple conditioning models. Like it gets kind of crazy. But basically the idea is we start with noise. This is actually what noise looks like in at least Midjourney as of 5.1. It probably looks a little different today. This is the type of noise it would generate. You feed it a text prompt and it goes through a series of iterations, and those iterations are called steps. And steps are going to become very important as we look at our own work and how we play with the steps through a image generation process. Each of these steps, it served as this iteration process. It generates an image. The CLIP model looks at the text prompt and kind of determines like how close it really is to that input. And then it feeds it a score. And those scores are kind of a little bit we can think of them as like a grade or like how closely this text prompt actually matches the image. And then it iterates again and it does another step. So steps are a really important thing for us to think about. We'll cover them probably more starting next week, or maybe the week after even. But essentially each step in an image generation process moves us closer to denoising the image, but also ideally moves us closer to our text prompt. So let's say we started at step 0, and obviously like this is purely noise. It's not going to look anything like this text prompt. So we have a very low score, but this clip model, which is this text conditioning model, it can kind of guide the image model in a certain direction. Like, hey, dogs usually look like this. Dolphins usually look like this. A dolphin is often in water, so we should see some water. And it can begin to guide the image toward that prompt. So you say maybe go 10 steps in. And you, again, this is an iterative process. It literally takes a step. It generates part of the image. It denoises a little bit of the image. It then compares it to the text prompt, gives it a score, and then does the next step. So over the process of these steps, the image guides a little bit more toward this sort of beautiful painting of a dog riding a dolphin. And then eventually we hit nearly the end of our steps, right? And the steps are like sort of predetermined. We say we want to do this in 30 steps, we want to do it in 10 steps, etc. And the goal is that this is going to get to something that is very close to the text prompt. Now, in 2021, I'm sure many of us tried image generation tools, and we found that like, wow, this is not anything like a beautiful painting of a dog riding a dolphin. We got like just a dog or a dolphin or like some weird dog-dolphin hybrid. Obviously, in the past 3 or 4 years, we've gotten much, much better in the way these tools work. And now we can generate images of a dog riding a dolphin. That's kind of the power of these tools. One thing to note is these steps are literal computational steps, meaning every step costs a certain amount of time, which is why these image generation models are actually quite slow. There are some real-time models out there now, but they've got some quality trade-offs. So there are now models that will do stuff in 2 steps, 5 steps, 3 steps, and are much faster and almost approach real time if you're on really nice hardware. But in general, if you want high quality images, you want to take more steps. And that means for most of us, it's going to take time. So these processes, if you do the full 30 steps, say in Midjourney, that might take 20, 30 seconds. And if you want to generate more than one image, it's going to be like a multiplication of that. So it's like 4 images times 20 seconds means it might take like a minute. It's not like an actual like linear like 4 times 20 whatever, but it's pretty close. So this is kind of one of the challenges we're going to face in this class is that this stuff is going to take time, especially as we want to generate more images, we want to generate more steps. And this gets into like a whole other thing we'll probably talk about more next week, which is like frame rate. If you want to generate something at a very, very high frame rate, that means you need a lot of frames, which means it's going to take a long time to generate all those images. So often I teach students at ITP who are very used to real-time rendering of stuff, and they're always heartbroken that like there's very little real time in AI tools today. I think it's changing a little bit, but it's still like you need a very, very powerful CPU or GPU to make that happen. So just be aware, like this is not necessarily like going to be a real-time class. Like we're going to generate some stuff, might not work out the way we like it the first time. We'll have to go regenerate again. This can take time. So just like if you're going to do a little bit of homework or each week, like kind of like carve out like an hour or two each week to kind of like experiment and play with these things, because they can take a lot of time. As we get further and further into our weeks, like I do have some automation processes. So maybe something you set up the night before you go to bed, you run it, you wake up in the morning, and you've got a video. It's great. But if you were to do that manually and sit there and like actually render each frame, it might take a couple hours. So these are kind of the trade-offs of these tools. So I've got other material around like text prompting, and this is like prompt engineering, which you probably have heard, which is like how do you write the prompt in the way that the machine thinks to get the right images out, like all that sort of stuff. I fucking hate text prompting. Like I come from a world before text prompting was like the way AI had to be made. And I'm just like, I still fundamentally think text prompting is kind of like a weird hack, and that in 2 or 3 years, like we will not have text prompting. Today, it's still important, it still matters, but like I think it's actually a really painful experience in that we are like conditioning a human to think like a machine rather than like the inverse. So a lot of what we're going to look at in this class will actually be doing using images as prompts. And there's a couple different ways to do that. We'll kind of look at some different techniques throughout the weeks. But I personally like, I don't like teaching text prompting. It changes with every single new model you use. It changes with every single like different idea and concept you have. It's just like there's a big learning curve around text prompting. I don't think I'm an expert at it. I like know ways to make it work for me, but it's like not my favorite process. So a lot of what we're going to look at in this class is really going to use images to basically like create additional images on top of. And that's sort of the idea where the stop motion comes into play, right? We can give like very basic shapes and then animate them or like add AI on top of them. That process is called image to image. So you'll often hear me describe it as image to image. So if you hear me you say image to image, that essentially means feeding an image in, doing a little bit of denoising. We'll go through the process in a minute, and then like basically painting almost on top of the image. I mean, think about it as like your skeletal structure that you're then generating images on top of. And that's kind of the process that we'll do a lot of this week or over the next couple weeks. There's also video to video, which is feeding in a video and then getting a new video on top of that. We might look at some of that next week when we use deform, because that's kind of what deform is great at. But there are different ways to do this, but I much prefer this process. Now, there are different ways to do image to image, or there's different ways that you can have an image guide and control the outputs. And that's what we'll look at over the next couple weeks. What we're going to cover today is a very, very basic image to image process, which is denoising. So the process for this is essentially, okay, we've talked about what the diffusion process is, right? We start with noise and we say, okay, here's my prompt, and then here's the image generated out of it, right? So it's like, okay, great. Like that kind of looks like what I prompted, but maybe it's not the exact image I want. Maybe it's not got the right like detail, like that sort of thing. So one of the things we can do is we can actually in this process also feed both a text prompt and an image. So let's say we take this image and we want to feed it back into the system. Now remember that there are a number of steps between this process, right? So this might be, this is step 0 and this is step 30. So we can also say take this image and put it in at step 15. And what we do is we add just enough noise to basically look like it's step 15. So we're kind of adding noise to this image, and then we're saying, hey, skip this whole step here, skip these 15 steps here, and just start from here and use this image as the base with a little bit of noise on top of it, and then denoise only from that amount. So basically we're denoising only 15 steps, and we're saying start with this image. Now, I should say this is not the best example because this image is not noised, but imagine there's like some popcorn noise on top of this image. We're basically denoising only 15 steps. Now, what's also really interesting here is depending on where you denoise from in these steps, you will get different results. And we'll be able to look at this a lot more in the next couple weeks. It's a little bit hard with Midjourney because Midjourney doesn't really expose this as a process. It's available to you, but it's like they kind of hide all of the actual like parameters. But essentially, depending on where you put this image in your steps, you will get a big difference from this image, right? So imagine if I put this all the way at, say, step 1, it's gonna be a lot of noise on top of that image. So it's going to change quite dramatically from my image to the new image between 29 steps. If I were to put it at 30, this is like 30 or 40. So I don't know, imagine this is 25 or 30 or something. If I were to put that in at this much later in the stage, it only adds a little bit of noise, meaning your image is going to be very, very close to this input image. So you're going to get new details. You're going to get new, like, maybe a little bit of change to the structure, but not much. If you put it in much earlier, see how in this case, like the images are actually different. This path here is now unified. Even our tree shapes are a little bit different, like that sort of thing. So where you put this image into our process here is going to change how much you change between these. And obviously when we talk about animation, that's quite important, right? Because images that you change over a sequence, like in a lot of animations, you want them to be quite similar, right? So we want to think about like, well, hey, how do we keep our images quite similar? We might want to look at a stepping where we input our images into steps. And again, we won't really cover that this much this week. I'll bring this up again when we get to like Eden and using those tools, because you have a lot more control over that step parameter and the denoising function as we get through that. So this is going to be a key thing. I'll bring this up again and again because people are going to want different levels of what we describe as stepping, right? Frame to frame. How different do you want the frames to be? Depending on how different you want them to be, you might want to think about where you are in this variation process. So yeah, if we move back to step 10 and put this image in here, you'll see it's very, very different. And this is, again, kind of this like interesting process of like, you kind of have to think like a machine, like how much noise am I adding to this image? how much noise do I want to remove? How different do I want this image to be from the input image I feed it? Now, I should also mention you still need to provide a text prompt. That's kind of the challenge here is like, it's both an image process and a text prompt process. There are other tools that we'll look at that can actually do the image without a text prompt, but that'll probably be in the last week of class. So there are ways to sort of skip the text processing, text prompting part entirely, but usually you need to do some of it just to sort of give it a guidance. This is also what's really helpful here is like, let's say I have a good structural image, but I want this to be blue, or I want this to be, I don't know, a nighttime scene instead of a daytime scene. That actually wouldn't work that well here. But let's say I want it to be blue instead of green. The further back your steps are, or the more noise you add to the image, your input image, the more likely you are to change the outputs. So anything you really want to make a big change to, like you dramatically want to change the shapes of things, then you want to be able to feed in stuff very early in the process. And this is something we'll look at, like a lot of things that I do are like I feed in a guidance video of like really basic shapes, like outlines, or just like a skeleton structure, or maybe just some blobs. In that case, you want to denoise quite a lot because you want to remove those blobs and like put something on top of it. But then the challenge is every step in an animation is going to be very different from each other. So there's a weird trade-off here of like keeping things consistent to make a smooth animation versus being able to do a lot of changes to your image based on the input image. This is going to be one of the things we're going to struggle with as we get through things. Yeah, Corinne.
Quick question. I mean, I don't use Midjourney all that much, but should we imagine that when it says like subtle versus extreme variance, they're essentially changing that variation then?
That's what we're going to look at this week, and that's exactly what they're doing. So Midjourney has a concept of what they call variation or vary. And there are two settings. There's strong and there's subtle. Subtle is going to be like essentially this, right? They're going to feed in the exact same image, and out of it, you'll get something quite similar to the input image with a little bit of difference, changes, that sort of thing. The strong setting is probably more like this, meaning they feed in the initial image, there's a ton of denoising, and then what you get out of it is very, very different. And that's kind of what we're going to play with this week, is just like using just that basic tool to see how variation our images can get. And when we sequence the animations, we'll see like someone will change a lot and someone will change very little. And that's kind of the fun process of like, once you understand, the other thing I think is important is like almost every image generation tool uses these processes, but they all label it something different, or they all have their own way of getting access to it. But once you understand the underlying process, then you kind of like, doesn't matter what they call it. You're like, okay, it's called subtle variation. Well, it's probably doing image to image. Or another place will be like denoising. And, you know, the challenge is sometimes they invert the slider. It's like sometimes the slider is like, if it's stronger, that means less variation or more variation. Like that's where it gets kind of confusing sometimes, but essentially the process is the same. And this means you can bounce between different different tools, and kind of find what works for you. And that's kind of what I think is important about this. Like if you understand the basic diffusion process, you're gonna be able to use pretty much any tool the way you want. And that's what's really helpful to sort of understand. Okay, so the reason I like this is it gives me a little bit more control. It means I can essentially draw a very basic shape and then add something on top of it. So this might be something like, I know Golan's probably gonna ask me this, like, could we use P5 to generate shapes and then generate images on top of those shapes? Yeah, that's exactly like a thing we could do here. And that's sort of what's cool about this process, is this gives you basic controls, meaning like a thing you could also do is like do something with stop motion where you're just moving shapes around the screen, and then animate those shapes, or say like, oh, the purple color should be this, the green color should be this, that sort of thing. So you can make very simple animations and then bring them to life, or like add layers to the thing by using AI. I think this is like where control becomes a really interesting aspect of this, is being able to play with different underlying structures and shapes and being able to use AI to like animate or do something that you probably couldn't do yourself in a short period of time. There's a lot of things we'll cover with this material and this idea and this concept, and that's each week we'll kind of add to our like sort of toolkit and look at different ways to explore these things. Okay, so as Corinne mentioned, we're like this week we're gonna basically like we're gonna make a bunch of images that are not animations, but they'll kind of create this moving and static like cinematograph effect. Essentially, is kind of what we're gonna look at. So we'll do that using Midjourney. I'm sure many of us have used Midjourney before. Maybe you haven't used the Vary tool. So we kind of fun to explore the Vary tool. And if you haven't used Midjourney before, they thankfully made it a lot nicer in the past couple months. It's like no longer stuck in Discord, which is great. Because managing animations in Discord was a nightmare. So it's much, much easier now using their desktop tool, which we'll look at. But I wanted to bring this up in like in animation. There's a concept of what's called the moving hold. And the moving hold is essentially like, think about how you can make an animation more interesting. So a lot of animations, it might be a person standing somewhere, but like people don't actually stand just completely static, right? So maybe in anime where they're being like very cheap, like they might just have a static animation. But if you look at like maybe more abstract animations or people that spend a little more time like really making very short animations or that sort of thing, you might see that like someone standing is like breathing, right? So it's like a character might be standing and they're kind of like, moving in and out a little bit because they're breathing. Or when humans stand, they don't like just stand static, they shift their weight back and forth because we're kind of always meant to be in motion, right? So the moving hold is this concept of like even static animations should still have some movement to it. And I thought I knew what a moving hold was, but like it turns out that like there's actually like a couple different concepts that people kind of move into the moving hold. So if you look up the moving hold, you'll see a lot of videos around this. And I tend to think like a lot of what people think about as moving holds today are more like easing, which is more like someone shouldn't just like lock into standing. They should kind of like slowly shift into standing. I've always thought of moving holds as like in more 2D animation where things kind of move. But then I found that some people call those line boils, which is like the idea of like a static shape should still have movement in the animation and the lines. And there's the concept of cinemagraphs, which I don't know if you have seen cinemagraphs for. It's basically like everything is static except maybe like someone's hair is blowing in the wind or something. So these kind of end up being a lot of different concepts, kind of like people call them different things in different spaces and that sort of thing. But I think the concept is the same, which is that we want to take a static animation and we want to kind of animate it. We want to bring it to life. Um, and this I think is just fun because it kind of like it allows us to do something different with AI images. Like, but it's very easy to do with AI images. Like using these variation tools in Midjourney, like it's quite easy for us to be able to create these sort of animations. So we'll go through the process of this and then we'll spend a little bit of time. Like if people have Midjourney subscriptions, if they want to sign up for it, we can go through just the steps of doing that. It doesn't take that long. The downside is very manual. It's a lot of like clicking buttons until you generate enough images and you download them. And then next week, I think we'll look at how to actually like sequence images together because that's kind of a whole other topic that we will definitely use more frequently in this class. So here's an example. I just went on YouTube and wanted to find someone who described how moving holds work. Um, this is again much more like sort of 3D animation. But you can kind of see like even when a character is static, there's still a little bit of motion. Like the sword is sort of waving a little bit. So you can kind of see what an animation looks like without that and how kind of like unrealistic it looks. Now, again, I'm kind of stretching that term to work for us, but like I think the idea still holds, which is like images should move a little bit, like they should have a little bit of animation. And we're going to look at is like, well, how much animation should they have? Should they have a lot of motion? Should they have a little motion? Should it feel like the thing is shaking and like, kind of like flickering in front of you, or should it feel like very, very fluid and very, very minute? And obviously that's like kind of up to you as the artist, right? Like, do you want it to be subtle? Do you want it to be not subtle? Like how should you make that work? And we'll kind of play with ways in which even with Midjourney, we can make that happen. And I think it's really funny because again, I sort of was highlighting that Paul Bush video. Like people are kind of bringing that back even today. Like so in gaming, there's like the thing where you like customize the character, and now we have humans that are like basically like doing that sort of motion where they're kind of like rocking back and forth. I just think it's fascinating how much like concepts of animation come back into like the real world, and like we're kind of like I don't know, like ping ponging back and forth between these different concepts. So I've seen a lot of like these TikTok videos of people basically like acting like, characters, and they kind of like do that like shifting on their balls of their feet kind of thing. It's very funny to see it kind of happen again in the world. Um, I've used this process a lot in my own films. I made this film very recently, and I sort of used this is based in Midjourney, so I actually made these in Midjourney, and I just use these as end credits for a film I was making. Again, I sort of like the idea that you can have this like very subtle, like the structure and the shapes are all there, but you can have a lot of difference even within those animations. And you'll see here, like depending on the text prompt or depending on the image itself, like different things happen. Like these tend to flicker a little bit more than the other ones do. Um, Part of this is also just getting a feel for these tools. Like one thing you kind of realize is that with image to image using this diffusion process, the colors tend to stay the same, but anything where the contrast is kind of low, you tend to get a lot of difference. If you have very high contrast differences, you will see that the contrast kind of keeps across the steps and across the subtlety. So you can kind of see again if in that first section here, um, because this pink on purple is kind of contrasty, the structure and the shape kind of tends to stay the same. Whereas in this other section, let's get to that section, come on. Because these are all soft pastels and there aren't as many contrasts here, you get very big variations in your images. And that's kind of a thing you kind of feel out, and also the individual tools themselves, because we don't have as much control within Midjourney. Midjourney kind of like, you've got subtle or strong. Those are the only two options. And we'll look at ways in which we can even kind of like get a little bit of middle ground. But essentially like these tools kind of like, you kind of determine like also by picking your favorites, like how the animation feels, whether it's very subtle or very different. So before we jump into actually doing this in Midjourney, I just want to go through the process. A funny thing about Midjourney is like Midjourney technically there's no video tools for Midjourney yet. I've heard they're in the process of making them, but we haven't seen them yet. But like if you only have access to Midjourney, you could still make animations. It's gonna be a little bit harder, but this process still works. And again, this is what I think is really important is like you don't need a video generation tool if you've got these tools and want to make something a little bit more stop motiony. So we'll kind of explore these different tools and see that there are different options across all of them. Okay, so Midjourney does have this nice tool called the variation tool or the vary tool, and that's kind of what we'll use for this. So essentially the process for this, we're going to generate images. Let me pop this open for everybody. I'm going to use the desktop tool because it's way easier to use today than yeah, smear frames are also another concept. Kevin, I don't know if you have any links to that, but that'd be great to post as well. All the concepts of kind of merge in different ways, and like different people talk about them in different ways, but there's a lot of different similar experiences here. So I'm going to use the Midjourney desktop or web tool. You can use Discord. They all work more or less the same. The Discord commands are a little bit different. The way you access different things is a little bit different. But I actually do find that like the way Midjourney, like the desktop experience works is much, much nicer now, or it's easier for me to be able to sort of edit and like see all my work in one space. Whereas before Discord, it was like 30 conversations and I have to keep track of all of them. Again, you don't have to create a Midjourney account tonight if you don't want to. Maybe you can see me go through the process and be like, I actually don't need to do that in Midjourney. Like I can do that in Stable Diffusion or whatever tool I already use today. But if you are interested in Midjourney, I think there's some interesting tools that are available that I do want to highlight. So we'll use this tool just to make some images, and then we'll download a bunch of images. And then next week, I think what we'll look at is how to actually sequence them. Many of you probably already know how to do image sequences, whether in Premiere, After Effects. We'll look at FFmpeg next week because it's like the tool that I use more frequently than anything else, just because a command line tool, it's very easy to use. I can use it on any computer I want. Might not always have access to Adobe, but basically we'll do that step next week. We'll talk about frame rates and that sort of thing as well. So the process, we're going to generate some images. We're going to pick an image we like from our set of images using prompting techniques and that sort of thing. And then what we'll do is we'll use the very subtle tool to make more images that are similar to those that image we liked. And then we'll collect our favorites. So I would recommend 40 images is probably a good set of images to make. You can go a bit lower and then maybe you need a slower frame rate, or go a bit higher and maybe a higher frame rate. It's kind of up to you, but I think around 40 is nice because we can make about a 5-second video that loops. These are very easy to loop because they're basically like the same image over and over and over again. And then we'll look at some tools to animate that stuff. So I'll go through the steps here and then we'll do it in Midjourney. But in this case, like I want to generate some images based on a film I shot a couple of years ago. So we'll look at prompt engineering tips in Midjourney because there are some cool ones that I really like. But basically, you generate some images. And you'll see each of these images looks a little bit different. This is because Midjourney is generating these completely from full steps. So say 30 steps or whatever. It's going to generate all these, and they're going to be quite different because of that sort of stepping process. Now, prompt engineering kind of keeps them a little bit closer to each other, different stylistic things that are available in Midjourney will keep them a little bit closer. But you'll see like some of them look quite different. Like, do I like this one that is more of like 3 panels? Do I like these that feel a little bit more like abstract, like that sort of thing? So it's sort of like maybe I don't like any of these and I'll recreate more images and just until I get one that I like. A lot of the AI process is just like generating lots of stuff and curating your favorites. Unfortunately, like prompt engineering is not perfect. You're never going to get exactly what you want every time. But you can sort of just design like, run these a couple times and just pick your favorite. So in this case, I would pick my favorite. Let's say I do like this sort of 3 panel look. Then what I would do is in Midjourney, there's a tool called Very Subtle. And that generates 4 more images for me. So I'll go ahead and click on that and do that. So it's going to generate 4 more images for me. And you'll see in this case, they are much closer to this image, right? I have this sort of 3 panel structure. Um, pink, the colors are all very consistent. Color, it tends to be one of the most consistent parts of these tools. When you do image to image, color stands out a lot more through noise than structure, but you still do get quite similar structures. But if I look here, you'll see the stems show up in different places. The actual angle or the actual sort of texture of the flowers itself are different. And this is kind of what I want. I want a little bit of that variation. So I might decide to go in here and click another one that I sort of like and create more subtle variations from that. And you can do this over and over and over again. You could literally just say like, I like all 8 of these. I'm going to do this process like 3 more times and get 40 images out. I guess you'd have to do it like 8 more times. But what I like to also do is I also like to pick my favorites and go very subtle from those. So you kind of have this like branching structure where like you're going down a different path based on using very subtles. Or you go back to your original images and you go back to the first one and make more subtle images from there. You can kind of create like a little bit of a wider range of images by kind of like traversing down this path of changing each image as you go down this tree. This is kind of the artistic intent, like how close do you want these images to look to each other is kind of up to you. If you basically like choose this image and just hit very subtle on those over and over and over again, you're probably gonna get images that are very similar to each other, in which case the animation might be a little bit smoother. If you go down this path of like picking different images and doing the very subtle with those, you'll likely get some different branches that I think are interesting then to sort of like create different effects or like create a little bit more of a bigger change in the frame to frames. We'll go over this in Midjourney in just a second. But essentially then what we're going to do is you just do this over and over again until you have a bunch of images you like. So what we can do is, this is an example of what I made last night, sort of doing this process. So you'll see here, like these are all quite similar. The actual structure of the flowers looks pretty similar. We're not getting a whole lot of variation between this. But I did go down different paths of sort of varying different images, that sort of thing. And you'll see like colors shift a little bit, different textures shift behind the scenes a little bit. Depending on the branch I go down, you'll see the different like, structures of the flowers change, that sort of thing. But this is all using subtle. What I do want to mention is there's also the strong variation. And the strong variation gives you bigger leaps, probably to a point where like it might actually be too much. But I have previous experiment with that as well. And this is an example of this where we're doing a little bit more of a bigger leap. And you'll see like this feels different in the sense that one, it's just a different concept, right? So it's like lava. So like it almost feels like you're looking at like different frames of a lava explosion. Whereas the flowers one, because it's structurally more similar, you get a little bit more of that cinematograph effect. And this is kind of an interesting thing where like depending on the prompt you input, depending on how you structure your animation, you have different feelings for your animation, right? This feels more like here's 12 different images from the same 2 minutes of footage of the thing exploding. We're just seeing different frames of that. Whereas the previous one feels a little bit more like it is the same flower structure and we're somehow perfectly picking out the right flowers, that sort of thing. So depending on how you choose your variations, you can get different effects. And you could use the strong effect to get like very wide changes, in which case you're going to get a lot more flickering of your images. But that's what's kind of cool about these tools is like just with these 2 options and your prompt, you can change dramatically how much the animation is changed and the effect of it. So keep that in mind as you like explore these tools. So I think it's kind of interesting to sort of explore and like figure out like, oh, how much variation do I want? How little variation do I want? When we talk about frame rate next week, it's like, well, if I have a big jump in frames, if I slow down the frame rate, it feels like our eye kind of like makes the connections for us, right? So there's different ways to think about this as we think about this class. And like, what I like about this is like Midjourney is very accessible, very easy to use. So anyone could do it. when we get to some of the crazier tools, it's like sometimes you have to have the mental capacity to like use all those tools in different ways. So Midjourney is a very easy way to start, and I like to use it just for the hell of it, just like let me generate a cool image and like make something with it. One thing I will say about Midjourney is their image generation tools are very good. They generate really nice individual images. Whereas other tools like say Stable Diffusion XL or Stable Diffusion 1.5 do not generate as good of individual images because they're a little bit older, training data, like that sort of thing. So Midjourney is worthwhile to leverage because it does generate really beautiful single images. And that's kind of what it's good at. Like it's very, very good at generating like very good realistic images, no matter what your prompt is. And that's kind of a thing you can leverage. If you're not big into prompting, like Midjourney is kind of a nice place to start because it almost always generates like a nice looking image. Very weird. It very rarely generates very weird looking bad images because it's been trained to do that. So just be aware of that. So let's go through the actual process of doing this in Midjourney. So I like to start, as I mentioned, I like to start with images. I hate trying to figure out text prompts. So almost what I always do is I start with an image. And Midjourney has a really cool feature where you can upload an image, and then actually from that image, it will help you describe it for the text prompting system. So the way to access that is to click on the image up here. And you'll see that I've already uploaded some images. You can also choose an image to upload. So let's see if I can quickly find an image I like. I have an idea here. Let me find this real quick. Here will take a second to load. Maybe not. Let's see. Okay, let me see if I can just grab these from here. So, boy, all my hard drives went to sleep. Come on. Cool. So I shot this like maybe a couple months ago. It's a let me get back here. All right. So I shot a bunch of these scenes on like a touch designer on a green screen background as well, or like a rear screen projection system. And I think it'd be kind of fun to maybe generate more images like this. Let me find one that I like. Yeah, that's good. Let's use that one. So what I can do is I can drag this image into our upload here. Oop. Oh, that's right. The other thing I found is that the images need to be a certain size. Let's use this image. Images need to be less than 10 megabytes, so I have to resize this. Oh, that should be good. That's the right size. Okay. So let me upload this. So once the image is uploaded, you can hover over the image and then click the eye icon. What that does is actually process the image in the way that Midjourney's text conditioning system uses. So you'll see here it adds a bunch of descriptions. So you can describe a subject, which is very interesting. Jim Morrison and Jean-Luc Godard. That's not exactly what that image looks like, but it's interesting. And then a bunch of descriptors. And the descriptors are what's really helpful. So I can say, I don't know, psychedelic dancer, um, I don't know, like let's say feedback system. And then I can add and click on all these descriptors to get sort of the quality here. So I could say like 1970 style, 35 millimeter, 70 millimeter, grainy film effects, shot on lomography. I'll just choose a bunch of these and we'll generate some images and see what we get. Experimental video art, red glow. Okay, cool. So what I like about this is like this is technically speaking the same language as Midjourney already speaks. So ideally, like these prompts should work well with Midjourney. Unlike, say, if I were to stick this into, I don't know, DALL-E or something, it might not work as well with them. So it's kind of cool is like it does give you this option. The other thing I'll notice here is like it's saying close up. So let me say close up of, and let's see if there's anything else here. Red light camera flash. So this might not be a perfect prompt for me, but at least I know that Midjourney is recommending these to me, and it's kind of helpful to use that. So this is a way that I can sort of skip a little bit of that text prompting option. So let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and click back here. Oops. Now I could actually use this image as part of the image to image process. If you actually select this image, it's actually going to stick it up here and it's going to do an image to image. It's going to use the input of this image. Again, you might want that, you might not want that. I'm going to actually remove this and we'll just generate a brand new image and see what we get out of this. The other thing is there are settings here. This is not a Midjourney class, so I'm not going to necessarily like go through each one of these steps. But in general, I like to make stuff in 4:3. That's my preferred ratio. But you could go like 16:9 if you want more of that like standard 1920 by 1080. The models, there is the standard model and the raw model. Raw model is better for photography. So I tend to pick that if I want something that looks like my own film work. Different versions, personalization. I'll see if I have any videos on like how all these different steps work. But in general, I kind of like just leave it as default, set my ratio, and then I start to play with things. So at this point, I've got all my prompt in here. I've got my sort of image size settings, that sort of thing. Let's go ahead and generate this. So I'll click off this and then I'll hit the little paper airplane icon. It's going to generate stuff for me. You'll see it gives you a percentage. This is literally like how many steps it's finished. So I think by default, Midjourney is like 30 steps or something. So it's really going through this process. And you will also see like kind of as it does it, you'll see um, the different like images sort of generating and denoising. So I've now got 4 images. You'll see they're quite different. I kind of like this one, but maybe we should do this again. Let me just use this again. And let me this time actually upload this image and see if I get something different that's more like this image. So we'll go ahead and let's see. Yeah, so let's run this. So this first step is just kind of like find an image you like, and then we'll use the variation tools to sort of build off that. So you'll see that because I gave it the input image, these are much, much closer to my input image. Now, maybe you like that, maybe you don't. There's different ways to sort of explore these, but I do kind of like these. I might just run this again. And to rerun this again, you can hit rerun right down here. Um, I also don't know what Midjourney's, how they publicly share these images these days. If you're one that doesn't want your work shared to their Midjourney system, you might want to look into how to make sure that this stuff stays private. I think Hide hides it from here and not from their privacy system. But there is a whole world where you can like go and look at all the images that other people have made and like sort of build off that. So if privacy is an issue, like be careful about Midjourney. It's definitely not like the most private system. It does share a lot of stuff in the Explore tab. So just be aware of that. I really like this. These two images are kind of cool. I like this one. So let's start with this one. So let's say like I really want to generate more images like this. So the easiest way to do this is just to hover over the image and hit very subtle. And you'll see like those images are quite similar. I guess maybe the different lighting effects on the sides, but the woman herself looks quite similar. A little bit of different lights on her cheeks and stuff, little highlights, but they're all quite similar. I was wondering if I could get like maybe more with like her eyes open. Let's try it again. think I could also edit this, right? Well, one thing we try here is that doesn't actually work. Okay. So this is kind of the challenge of different subtle images will do different things based on that image to image process. Now, if we look at what very strong does, we get quite different images. You'll notice it also takes longer to do very strong. Remember that we've got that step process. When you change the amount of steps you actually denoise, it takes less time. So very subtle will actually take less time to generate those images, whereas very strong will take longer, whereas generating completely from scratch will take the longest. So here we see that we've got different images. These are quite different. And if we were to animate using these, we would get like a lot of different effects, like the head moving quite a lot, quite dramatically. We could do this, but it would probably require a little bit of like a slower frame rate, almost like it's like a like stop motion, like almost like blurred, like static shots or like a blurred I'm looking for open shutter kind of experience. So like the ways to do this, the other thing I highly recommend you do is like before you get too far on this path, like make a folder for yourself. So I'll just make a folder on my desktop and we'll just call this rear screen, Midjourney. Um, Midjourney has improved their ability to organize, but the problem is the organization stuff happens in this other tab. So you can't like create and organize at the same time. Quite annoying, actually. So what I recommend you do, or the way I work, is I generally download to a folder. So any of my favorite images I like, I will generally download to a folder or maybe subfolders of different image categories. So in general, if I want to start with this one, I'll click on this guy and I'll hit download. Yeah, my Finder's really crawling today. Or Chrome is really crawling today. One of the two. There we go. Okay. Um, These will all save with different names based on the run you made, and the number, the index of the images it produced for you. So it will always generate new names. You won't overwrite in your files, which is nice. If you do like generate the same image or try to download the same image, it will get like append a 1 or a 2 to it. So you want to be careful of that because you don't necessarily want to download the same images every time, unless that's the effect you're going for. Totally different topic, maybe, but like essentially you kind of want to download as you go, so that way you're not like, oh, wait, did I download this image already? Like that sort of thing. Like there's really not a good way to organize stuff as you work in Midjourney. I think they still need to work on that a little bit, but you can kind of see like, okay, I've created some images. Maybe I want to like download a couple of these. Like maybe I'm interested in like, I think I like the lighting effect of this one. So you could literally download like, each one of these images one by one and then curate once in your folder. It's kind of up to you. Everyone has their own process. I generally like to sort of pick and choose my favorite images as I go. Um, so I'll just sort of grab a couple of these and download them. And so let's say like I like the fact that this light sort of catches her cheek in this way. So maybe I'll do more variations and hopefully kind of keep some of that. So let's go very subtle. You can also see her hair changes a lot. This will be kind of interesting animation to see if the face stays really similar, but if the hair and other things around her kind of change. Also, and then I would also like, again, kind of go into very subtle for more of these. So maybe I'll grab some of these and download them. And so this is my process for using Midjourney. It's very manual. It's just like generate a bunch of images, download your favorites, and then like keep generating, or maybe try a different topic, or the other thing we could do here, which would be kind of interesting, is Midjourney also just released this editor feature. So if you click on this image and you go to the use or more editor, you click on the editor, and I think you can go in here and just sort of like erase sections. And let's say this might be kind of crazy. Let's see how crazy this is. Eyes open, and let's say submit. Where does that go?
I think it goes back to your home. Yeah. If you go to, yeah.
Yep, there we go. Cool. So we got someone with eyes open. So you could also do this where you could almost just like edit individual sections and like make little prompt changes and see if that gives you enough of an effect. Those eyes are getting a little weird. We can work with it. So again, there's different tools within this palette to sort of make different changes. I think it'd be interesting to sort of see what you can generate using just the Midjourney tools themselves. So the other nice thing is because we're kind of doing this stop motion effect, if you want to sort of like visualize what your animation might look like, you can just sort of use the preview to just like open these and just click through. So yeah, those eyes opening is a little creepy. That's cool. So again, I would just do this over and over again until I had about 40 images, maybe more, maybe less. What we'll look at next week is we'll look at actually how to loop this stuff and how to generate the actual video. So this loops, I think, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And because we've got 40 frames, like you don't catch where it loops because it just like feels like it's very different. So again, it's the ability to make just a handful of images and then loop it long enough and like it just feels like it's endlessly changing. This one is again kind of the same thing. I think there's only like maybe 20 images in this one. So you'll see, depending on the prompt, you can go very, very subtle, right? So with this prompt, like the images, the face itself doesn't really change that much, which is kind of cool. I actually like that. Different grain until we get the eyes open. But everything else around her kind of changes, which is kind of nice. Again, it has that more cinematograph effect. Whereas if I were to do that lava one, the lava one is lots of changes here and there. And you'll get different effects depending on the prompt, depending on how, because I'm choosing new variations with each one of these, maybe I do more very subtles off the eyes. Let's see if we maybe get some more like less creepy eyes. Yeah, those are nice. So like now we've got these. Yeah, there's slightly less creepy eyes. And then if I very subtle off these again, like, we're gonna get different variations with each one of these. So this one has this nice little like highlight right here. I look at the weirdest things. It's just like every artist is gonna have their own way of experiencing like, oh, I like that image because this one detail or whatever. But I think it's fun. I don't know, I like the curled hair in this one. Let's download this one. So this is a process, just sharing a bunch of images. And you can always kind of test them out by just sort of opening a preview. That's kind of nice, actually. Almost looks like she's like opening her eyes. It's cool. See, I would just do this for another 20 minutes until I had 40 images, right? Maybe I want to get really deep into this. Oh, so Golan, this is where we're going to talk about next week. Well, optimized route is an interesting question. That's one of the tools that I have made for myself, and I think I'll at least share a demo on how to do that, because it is kind of fun to think about that, about what optimization means or how you can do that route. So next week we'll look at a couple of ways. We could just sequence this based on purely the order in which you downloaded them. There will be we can look at like using After Effects and other tools and actually randomly like changing up the order of sequences, right? This is where it also gets really fascinating, is how you sequence the images might say something different than another thing. And that's where like there's a ton of opportunity to make your own different style of animation or your own way of doing, you could flicker between the eyes opening and closing. You could slowly have the eyes opening based on some sequence of optimization or again prompting or that sort of thing. So there's a bunch of different ways to explore like how you actually animate these sequences, and we'll cover those for the first half of next week, I think. Although we certainly won't cover everything. But we'll look at that and we'll look at frame rates and that sort of thing. So we'll look at how to actually animate this stuff because that will be important as we go and think about future animations as well. Cool. Okay, so that wraps up this week. So again, I would say between now and next week, if you like using Midjourney, if you're interested in this process, like the goal is to just like create a bunch of images. So generate 40 images maybe it crosses a couple different options or a couple different prompts. As long as you make a folder of images, next week we'll look at how to sequence those. We'll definitely look at how to just use FFmpeg to just like sort it by the file name and then generate a sequence off that. I'll show a technique on a tool that I have for After Effects. It's a little script that actually randomizes all the frames in the order you have. There might be something similar for Premiere, that sort of thing. Could probably generate something similar using like a Python script or something. It's more code-based. I will probably share a recording on how to do the sequencing based on a machine learning model, like actually figure out the order, like the proximity of images. Challenge with that one is it's quite computationally expensive because it's like, depending on how many frames you have to look at every single frame in the sequence. So when I made that film Dot, it looks at 4,000 frames. And 4,000 frames using these tools took about 2 to 3 days to sequence that entire frame set. So it's not ideal. There's probably better ways to optimize it, but there's different ways to explore that. So I'll at least record a video on how to do that, and then we'll look at that as well next week. But yeah, so basically, as long as you have a bunch of sequences of images, maybe if you want to figure out like the actual order you want to process them in, maybe numbering those files would be helpful. It's going to help like make the process a little easier. If you have an actual order you want to process them in, then definitely sequence or number your files. If you just want to go random and crazy, which is usually what I do, we can look at some very easy ways to do that. So we'll look at that the first half of next week. We'll talk about frame rates. We'll talk about sequencing. And then we'll also look at Dreamform, which is actually more of a video tool. And it's probably more like along the end of what I would want to teach, which is like video to video. But there are ways to do stop motion with it. And it's also a very easy tool to use. So then we'll kind of like go in order of ease of use. So we'll look at Dreamform. And then after that, we'll sort of look at more of the more complicated tools. We can really dial in all the details we want. Yeah, Corinne.
Another question. When you're talking about the script that you used for Dot, like how is it analyzing likeness? Is it looking at it compositionally and through color and texture, like factoring in all those things, or does it index on one more than others?
It's a machine learning model that looks at all the features. So a deep neural network is going to explore both. It's going to basically balance out all those features. So it's going to be both, shapes, colors, forms. But I do find that like there's 2 different models you could use, and each model works slightly differently. One I find works a little bit better for black and white stuff. One works a little bit better for color. There's also big speed differences. One of the models uses like a mixture of experts, meaning it looks at 4 different models and chooses based on the averaging of those 4 models. That one takes forever to try to use. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that if you have a lot of images. But yeah, there's different ways to approach that. And if you watch Dot, you'll kind of see like you kind of get it, but it also like feels a little foreign. The way it animates certain things, it's like, oh, interesting. It's not how I would have chosen stuff. And that's kind of what I think is cool about these tools is like, it's a little bit of like, well, that's not how I would do it, but it also would probably take me a year to sequence every image one by one, right? So like this model taking 4 days, like a little bit less time, but like it does things in slightly different ways than I would expect. And that's what kind of what I like about these tools. A little bit of hands off, a little bit of hands on. But yeah, I can share a video on how to do that next week. It is computationally expensive, probably fine for like 40 images. But when you've got a lot of images, it's a big lookup table and it takes a long time to do that stuff. So yeah, just be aware of that. Cool.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for a really cool first class. Obviously, everyone might be like, Midjourney, I've done this before. So I promise after this, we'll get into more exciting tools. But I think it's just a fun place to start with to generate some cool animations. And then definitely we'll look at more controllable tools as we get further along.
That's awesome. Thanks,
All right.
Jeff.
So I will create, I'll create a Slack channel, or in our Slack channel, in the async one, I'll create just like a thread for people to share like images. If you already know how to sequence your images, you might want to upload the video that way. Maybe you just want to share a handful of images that you made, maybe any insights you find, because if you find different prompts, different images, like you get different results with these things. And that's kind of what's fascinating and also really frustrating. There's no like one solution for everything. So that's what is cool about this group is we can share different insights based on what we find works, what doesn't, that sort of thing. Yeah, so I'll start a thread for that, and I'll start a thread for questions. And then if anyone wants to come through Friday night, we'll do a Q&A. So if you have questions about this work, any of the work I've shared this week, like I'm happy to chat about any of that. And those are optional. I'm not expecting people to show up. What I'll usually do is on the night before, I'll just say like, hey, does anyone have anything they want to talk about? If no one responds, I might just assume no one wants to show up. So if you do plan to show up, like, please just give me a heads up. Like I'll usually just ask like, hey, give me a thumbs up if you plan to attend. Because it is optional, but also like it's my Friday night. If I don't have to be there, I won't be there. But it's also open for anyone. So yeah, if you do want to use it, please don't feel bad about using it. Like I never want people to be like, oh, I don't want to take up your time. It's like, no, you pay to take up my time. So take up my time. But at the same time, if no one's going to be there, I'm not going to hang out and wait for anyone to show up either. Cool.
Cool.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. And I'll talk to you over Slack this week and then see you in the next couple days.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.